Dis nie 'n backup.
Dis 'n short-term backup en dis ook vir power fluctuations. Hou dit die krag mooi skoon sodat jou sensitiewe toerusting beskadig word. Dis die UPS. Maar die manne kan hulle verkoop het verkeerde ding. Dis verstaan ook. Nou, dit is die UPS.
Ja, hy's oud.
Good to go.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Cameron Smith from Techlogix. I'm very honored to be here today as a guest presenter to go through the fiber optic workshop. This is a course that we have taught in conjunction with CEDIA and BIXI for several years now. It's a course that really is designed to help people better understand the fiber optic infrastructure, the different parts and pieces that come together to make a fiber optic system operational. And we're going to be going over a lot of content today. So we will be spending about 50 to 55 minutes talking about different fiber products and how we wire those and make them all work as a system, and even things like, what do you do if the system doesn't work? This is a really nice course for people to learn about this new infrastructure, at least new to the AV industry. And it's certainly something that we get a lot of attention on. And we've taught this course now for about 5 years. So a couple of things before we get started. Everyone is muted, so it's hard to ask questions just because we get a lot of folks on the webinar, but we do want your questions. Please type those into the Q&A section that's in the Zoom software. We'll get to those questions at the end of the session. Or if it's a very complex answer, we'll make sure to give you a phone call, we'll get you an email, we'll get you the answers that you need. Now, the second thing that I want to mention is we're recording this. This is industry content, okay? So feel free to not only share the recording, you'll get an email with the link, but feel free to share the recording, and also you can request the slides. You can email us at info@tlnetworks.com. We're happy to share these slides with you. And then finally, if you're coming to us today because you want CEDIA or BIXI renewal credits, this course counts towards those. You see the course codes on the screen. We can get you certificates of attendance and completion. We're happy to do all of that. So a little bit before we get started here, but now we're ready to start talking about fiber. And let's really start the presentation today talking about the why. Why are we seeing fiber optics in the AV industry? Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. First of all, fiber is not a new product category. It's not a new technology. It's actually been around for over 50 years, okay? But we haven't really seen it in AV up until recently. And in fact, most integrators, they tell us, look, they've never really worked with fiber before. They've never really even thought about it as a standard or necessary towards their business. They thought about it as this future cable that's sitting out there, no real practical application. It's almost this curiosity, and that's fine. Fiber was largely about future-proofing until recently. Now what you'll find, and we'll look at some actual metrics here. We'll look at the bandwidth required for different signals, but what you're finding today is you have to be looking at optical cables. There's significant benefits and requirements that say in the AV industry or even the security industry, you know, all kinds of different markets, we're now embracing this category of products. Now, here's the good news. If you've never pulled a fiber cable before, you've never designed a system, you've never worked with it, you're completely new to this, that's okay. The fiber ecosystem, so the parts and pieces we put together to make a system operate, it really isn't that much different than the copper products we've been using for years, the twisted pair cables of the world, the extenders, things like that. What do I mean by this? Well, we can break this category down into really 5 different product groups. Most people think of bulk cable when they think of fiber. And we build that bulk cable in a couple of different ways. We'll build with bend-in sensitive glass. This is like a Corning type product. So you might have heard of Corning. You might have heard of Clear Curve, which is a type of bend-in sensitive glass, or SMF28. It's another type of bend-in sensitive glass. Basically, this is a really durable, type of glass core that goes in the cable, and it allows you to send lasers really long distances. I mean, that's what fiber optics are all about, transmitting lasers from point A to point B. You might have also heard of SSF technology, clear line technology, okay? This is where we take that glass and we surround it with a polymer, okay? Different ways to build the cable, but it still serves the same function of transmitting signals from point A to point B. Now, this category, these cables, they also come in different formats, armored and direct burials and tacticals, just everything you'd see in the copper world. You know, the same types of formats that you deal with twisted pair like Cat 5, Cat 6, Cat 7, that's available in fiber. But where you really start to see a departure from what we're used to working with is in the pre-mades, the patch cords, what we would call a pre-terminated cable. Pre-terminated cables in the fiber world will come in a variety of lengths. We tend to think about, you know, I've got a twisted pair patch cord. It's going to be a short length little cable. I'm going to tie a couple of network switches together, or maybe I'm going to take some extenders and connect them to an AV matrix, right? That's what we think about when we think of pre-terminated cables, patch cords. But in the fiber world, well, yes, you could have a 1 meter, a 2 meter, a 5 meter cable, and we do that every day. You also get really long length cables. In fact, fiber is surprisingly strong. It's surprisingly small. It's actually more durable than most people realize. And pre-terminated cables in the fiber world are incredibly common, even in lengths of 300 meters, a mile, you know, 12 kilometers. You get very long length factory terminated cables that you literally just pull through conduit, or you bury in the ground, or you pull through the wall. And these come from the factory with the ends already on them. And the reason I spend so much time talking about this when we start the session is because this is where most integrators start. They start with pre-terminated cables because it's easy. You just get a cable, it's built to whatever length and configuration you want. You get it, you plug it in, your system is up and running. Keep that in mind. And here's the most surprising thing about the pre-terminated category. Those cables will often cost less than buying bulk cable and connectors. And that is because the connector that goes on the end of a factory terminated cable is actually less expensive, significantly so, than the type of connectors we terminate in the field. You just have less moving parts. So this is something you want to keep in mind as you get started with fiber. Now, today we'll also be talking about things like the wall boxes and the rack trays and all the other installation accessories, but it's the electronics. The electronics have really been the game changer for the AV industry. Because keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, fiber is not new. Fiber has been around for over 50 years. A lot of folks in the AV industry, a lot of people who come to this course that want their credits, they have done fiber before, and they'll tell me, look, I wired this house, I wired this building, I did fiber, I pulled it, never used it. And the reason it was really not deployed in the AV industry up until recently is because you didn't have a lot to plug into that cable. Well, that's changed. Now we do have electronics, we do have network switches, we do have HDMI extenders, we do have AV over IP boxes. There are a lot of electronics that actually let us use this fiber today. But more importantly, we have to do this. We absolutely have to think about fiber for our systems. Let's talk about bandwidth, okay? There's two ways to dice bandwidth. Point-to-point video bandwidth and streaming network bandwidth, two very different things. Point-to-point video bandwidth is us taking a signal from the video source to the destination, the display, right? And that point-to-point video bandwidth, depending on the type of video you're transmitting, it can get pretty significantly large. And I'm sure that the different folks who are on this webinar today, you've seen this transition from standard def to 1080p, and now we talk about 4K, right? 4K is kind of that standard. And 4K is a very interesting format because 4K has a lot of different moving parts, right? A frame rate, color space, HDR. Well, the punchline here is if you put all of that together to craft this 4K signal, what you'll find is 4K, as we deploy it in most systems in the residential and even the commercial market, will push up to 18 gig in bandwidth, okay? 18 gig. That's when we have 4K, what we would call 4K 60, so 60 frames per second, 444 color space, and we're enabling HDR and multi-channel audio. 18 gig per second. Twisted pair, so whether you're talking about Cat 5, Cat 5e, Cat 6, even Cat 7, well, that's got a top ceiling of 10 gig, okay? And that's only over short distances. Most enhanced twisted pair cables are only rated for 1 gig. Well, it doesn't take a math scholar to realize that an 18 gig signal is not going to travel down a 1 gig or a 10 gig cable natively. And the key word there is natively, because guaranteed, I'm sure folks on this webinar today, you have used HDBaseT extenders to move 4K, right? We do it every day, but we don't do it natively. What we do is we take the 444 color space and we compress it. We compress it down to 420. It takes that 18 gig signal, gets it down below 9 to 3 gig. So depending on your algorithm, it gets it really small, transmits it, and then blows it back up. Now, it works. It's not perfect. You get things like latency, you get some color banding. It's hard to even tell that it's been compressed in most, live motion picture. But it's there. It's a compressed signal. It's possible. But now we turn our attention to 8K, okay? And we're just starting to see 8K really proliferate in the marketplace. Here in the United States, where I'm located, you can probably tell from my US accent, right? We're seeing 8K displays, and we have seen 8K displays for the last 2 years. In fact, we've also seen the prices come down pretty significantly. You're getting 8K displays for $2,000 to $3,000 now. But I will tell you that most of those displays employ scaling engines, okay? It's not native content. So let's dissect this a little bit, because first thing you need to understand is the 8K signal requires up to 48 gig in bandwidth. And while it is possible to compress 18 gigs, so 4K, onto a twisted pair, you can't do it with 8K. It's too big, too much compression. 300-to-1 compression algorithm won't work, okay? So that's the first thing you got to understand. If you've got an installation that's going to want 8K, you got to have an optical cable in the wall. Second thing you need to understand is while most of the displays and projectors do employ scaling, it's not because there's a lack of content. It's because there's a lack of available content, okay? Let me explain that a little bit. We actually film TV shows, movies, sports are really the best example of this. We have filmed content for years in 8K. That's how we do things like instant replay. We grab part of the image and zoom in because we have the pixel density. We film in 8K, but we don't broadcast it. And this is really the missing link for most installations and most people when we talk about 8K. It's getting that content that's filmed in production, right? Getting that content to the actual consumer who has an 8K display that can take it. And this is where you're really seeing a shift. Think about your installations. How do we get video to the home, video to the business? Well, it used to be we had a satellite box, a cable TV box, a set-top box of some sort, right? Well, what we're seeing is we're transitioning. We're transitioning to streaming media. And 8K is the first broadcast standard that's not designed for broadcast. It's actually designed to be streamed. And this is really the missing link in all of this conversation, right? Getting the content to the consumer with the 8K display. Well, it's predicated on the market shifting to a streaming deployment of signals. And guaranteed, we're all seeing this in our installations. That big video matrix is now starting to be replaced by people with an Apple TV or a Roku or some other smart TV, some sort of device that streams those signals. And 8K is designed for that. In fact, here in the United States, several of our very large satellite and cable TV providers, they have now already switched to streaming content delivery because this is what we are seeing from a trend, right? This is how the consumers are getting their media now. And that turns the conversation to the network. Network streaming bandwidth. Very different than point-to-point video bandwidth, okay? Let's dissect this a little bit. So one of the trends, I'm sure you're familiar with CES here in the United States. Well, one of the CES statistics is looking at the average middle-class home, how many connected devices do we have, okay? In the United States, the average US middle-class home has, 2 years ago, 2018, 23 connected devices. That number is expected to exceed 50 connected devices this year. So you've seen a doubling of all of the media players and the smart wearables like your watches and your network controllable devices like thermostats and lighting controllers. You're seeing a doubling over 2 years, and that trend line is expected to continue. And we can take those devices and we can lump them into 3 categories: low bandwidth devices, moderate bandwidth devices, and high bandwidth devices. And this is really the heart of understanding streaming bandwidth, okay? How much bandwidth is required to really guarantee a connection, guarantee our devices that are pinging the internet, pinging the network are going to operate properly? Well, if we look at things like controllers and thermostats and wearables, I have little kids. Half of my kids' toys are Wi-Fi enabled for some reason. They don't take a lot of bandwidth. They take on average, real statistic here, 0.2 meg per connection. That's a minimum requirement, but it's not a lot of bandwidth, okay? You can do this on a really old piece of Cat5. It'll handle these devices. Now keep in mind, that's per concurrent connection. So if I have 100 of them, well, now that starts to add up, right? Then we look at audio distribution, IP phones, streaming music, okay? 1 meg per connection. Granted, if you're having a household and maybe you've got 4 phones that are IP enabled, not a lot of bandwidth. But if you're doing an office building and they've got 200 phones that are IP based, now you're starting to talk about a real system here, where we really have to start doing this calculation to make sure it all works. And now we turn our attention to video. Video takes more bandwidth. Standard definition, okay, IP security cameras, video doorbells, things like this, actually not as much bandwidth as a lot of people think. 2 meg per concurrent connection. And most applications don't have 1 security camera, they're going to have multiple. So you got to add this all up again per concurrent connection. But if we were to take those video devices and now make them HD, high definition, we really see a jump. So 1080p, 5 meg minimum bandwidth requirement, 4K, 25 meg, 8K, as I have a consumer that today they're doing 4K or 1080p and tomorrow they want to jump up to 8K, well, 60 meg per concurrent connection. And if we look at that house, if we look at that business and we start to say, well, we've got 5 rooms, each one's going to have a smart TV or a streaming media player, and I've got phones and I got music players and I've got all this other stuff going on, a security system, it really starts to add up fast. And this is why you really got to pay attention to the design of your network, and you've got to forecast out and say, look, how are we going to get our video in the future? How is this going to work? Will I have an infrastructure that can handle all of this? And keep in mind, this is inferring that we're going to stream these contents in. This is not video bandwidth. Once we get the signal to that media player and it gets unpackaged, right? You take the packets of data and you put them together, all of a sudden that 25 or that 60 meg connection turns into an 18 to 48 gig requirement. So once that media player needs to be connected to the display, you really have to have an optical line if you expect to deal with 8K, 12K, 16K, right? This is what we're already seeing now in DisplayPort and USB-C. The industry is moving fast. So keep this in mind. This is something that really impacts us, whether we're commercial, residential. Things are getting bigger and bigger in terms of signal bandwidth. But guaranteed, 50 years ago, a lot of smart people sitting around a table talking about fiber, designing the standard, they were not thinking, I want to be able to watch Netflix in high definition, okay? That's not the intent here. Yes, the cable's great for that. but fiber was really designed for some other benefits. I'm pretty sure everybody who's on the webinar today is pretty familiar with lightning issues, right? Lightning strikes. Well, fiber is completely immune to that. And this is one of the reasons we see it in a lot of outdoor transmission. You protect your systems. Fiber will not transmit power surges, lightning, static electricity. It won't even be impacted at all by EMI, like electromagnetic interference and RF. It's immune to all of this. This is why we use it in a lot of mission critical installations, like medical, like government, like military. Fiber is really good at protecting the signals and making sure there's integrity, even over very long signal distances and very compromised systems, like when you're running around big motors or you're putting cables on planes and in yachts and things like that. It also goes really long distances. This is what a lot of people think of when they're connecting buildings together, cities together, continents together. Fiber sends signals very long distances. So there's a lot of other benefits that you'll see with this optical cable, but I'll tell you, none of this really matters if you cannot install the cable effectively, if your techs can't, put connectors on it and work with it in the field, if you can't, design a system and make sure that it works, and your customers can't afford it. And arguably, this has been the largest advancement, in my opinion, over the last 2 to 3 years in the optical category, the deployability. So we do a lot of trainings here at Techlogix, right? You're taking one of, dozen plus that we offer. Of all the different sessions that we host and all the different content that we have, this is my favorite slide. Because in my opinion, this slide really dispels a lot of the myths that people have about this optical category. Because trust me, when we teach these courses live, and we'll get a bunch of folks in a room together, what they'll tell me is, and I'll ask them when we start the session, what do you know about fiber? And they'll tell me, well, it's really fragile. It's really expensive. It's really hard to terminate, and the tools are really expensive. And I don't want to go to a class for a week to get certified. And oh, by the way, there's lasers that, they'll blind you if you look at the cable. And there's shards of glass, and if you get it in your skin, it'll travel through your blood, and it'll get in your heart, and you'll die. This is the stuff that we very, often will hear. And yes, a lot of that is based on historical fact, early days of fiber technology. But if we look at the technology today, and let's start by looking at one of the most commonly deployed types of fiber worldwide, single mode duplex fiber. Very, very common. This is the standard in residential, commercial. This is the go-to cable in most industries and applications. Well, if you look at this cable, it's as close as you can get to a universal cable. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, you get low smoke, zero halogen rated, plenum rated. Same cable will also be water rated. Fiber is really nice. Remember, we're not transmitting any electricity. It does mean you have to power your devices at both ends, but these cables that can go in any environment can also be fully submerged in water, and it has no impact on them. They're fine. So this cable can go anywhere, but it can also do anything. It can handle audio and video and control and network. Same cable does all of that, even things like USB. But here's the really important thing to focus on, because people think that this is a really fragile type of cable. Well, first of all, it's 30 to 60% smaller than twisted pair. It's thin, very small, but it's strong, 100 to 220 pound pull rating. This is one of the strongest low voltage cables you'll get. 7.5 millimeter bend rating, meaning you can wrap it around your fingers, it won't break. Okay, that's where the optical category has come. Totally future-proofed, 100 petagigs. Technically, it's 100 petagigs in terms of bandwidth capacity. So tons of bandwidth, you're future-proofing. But here's the punchline. Here in the United States, the average trade price of that cable is 20 cents per foot. It's cheaper than most twisted pair. This is why you are seeing so much fiber now being deployed. Now, it does help that the largest glass manufacturer in the world, Corning, is located here in the United States. But worldwide, we're seeing the same trend. When you start to look at different markets and, you know, you're starting to see more optical cables, it's actually less expensive for a lot of these fiber optic configurations versus a twisted pair cable. Plus it's smaller, plus it's stronger, plus it handles more bandwidth. And oh, by the way, with new snap-on connectors, you can terminate this stuff very quickly. So this is a category that has a lot of upside potential, and it actually saves you money. It saves your customers money. So this is definitely something that a lot of people aren't aware of, but we always want to make sure that people understand the mathematics behind what's going on here. So let's talk about the cable. Let's talk about the cable for a minute. Fiber optic cables have a couple of different parts to them. Now, if you look at just the spool of cable, yes, it's small, very compact. It's when you cut back that outer jacket that you really start to know that you're dealing with something different, optics, right? And that's because very evident in an optical cable is the strengthening fiber, the yarn. That yarn inside the cable is deceptively strong. We manufacture that out of aramid Kevlar, okay? The same thing that goes into protective equipment like gloves and bulletproof vests go into these optical cables. And this is what gives you your 100 to 220 pound pull rating. And you can take these cable or this yarn, right? You can pull the cable with it, but you got to get it out of the way in order to really terminate, to work with the core, the optical core. And this is where you'll have, you know, bend and sensitive glass, or maybe it's coated with a polymer, different ways we build that core, but this is where the lasers travel. And depending on how many cores you have in the cable, or what we would call a strand of fiber or a strand of glass. We don't talk about fiber in terms of conductors because you're not conducting any electricity. We talk about fiber in terms of strand count. And one core or one strand of glass is known as simplex fiber. Now here's the thing. You will see simplex fiber used for building-to-building wiring, like your demarcation point wiring. You'll also see it for some AV applications like your HDMI extender. My advice is you never pull simplex because, and I'm not exaggerating here, 99% of electronics out there do not work with simplex. They work with duplex, 2 strands of fiber, okay? And the reason is it's less expensive to build electronics that send using one piece of glass and receive using the other. It's less expensive for the cable than it is to put the processing, the multiplexing circuits in the electronics. And if you only pull simplex, you're really not future-proofing that application. You're not future-proofing that cable run. You need duplex. And when you start to, and by the way, that 20 cents per foot US cost for this cable, that's a duplex cable. That's why it's one of the most popular cables out there. Now you'll also get into multi-strand fiber, 4-strand, 6-strand, 12-strand. I mean, you'll get into very high strand counts, 144, 288. You'll get, you know, into this it's not a bulky cable. It's actually a very small cable, but very high strand counts because these strands, you know, they're the diameter of a human hair. They're really small. They're really fine. Okay, we measure fiber in terms of microns. And if you've never seen an optical cable, well, when you look at a cable that's the diameter of a pencil and you realize there's 48 pieces of fiber popping out of it, it can really be intimidating because undoubtedly people think, well, how am I going to terminate this? How am I going to work with this? And the answer is you can, and you can do it pretty easily, but you got to make sure you have the right equipment. And one of the most important parts of any fiber system is the enclosure. Fiber optic enclosures play a couple of different roles, whether you're dealing with a rack tray or a wall box or a Demarc box. What these do is they take the small strands inside that cable and they break them out to the individual connectors, but they also secure those strands so they don't get broken. Because the smaller strands inside the cable, that's the weak point. And they really need to go in some sort of an enclosure that keeps them from moving around and it makes sure they shoot the laser straight. But that enclosure also serves another purpose. You'll notice that the cable is coiled up inside of it. So fiber optic enclosures will also manage the service loop. You can actually take your extra fiber and coil it up. So if you have a pre-terminated cable and maybe an extra 20 feet or 50 feet of cable, you can actually coil it up inside that box or that rack tray. And that enclosure also manages the bend rating, the bend diameter, because older fiber, you had to be careful. You didn't want it to break. Now, modern cable, it's very pliable. It's what we call bend insensitive. And you don't really have those issues, but older installation, it was a problem. So having that service loop, having that bend radius inside the enclosure is a very important part of this whole conversation. All right, let's talk about the different types of fiber, because there are two different types, and it has to do with the size of the glass inside. Single mode is kind of your do-all cable. It can be short distances, it can be long distances. It also supports the highest amount of bandwidth. And, you know, a little bit conversely to what we're used to dealing with in cable manufacturing, like the copper world, it's also got the smallest core diameter. It's a 9-micron core. Single mode is what we use to pre-wire many buildings. Okay, it's also what we use to do the long distance telecom feeds. That same cable that can go in the wall is the one that connects the buildings and connects the cities. And the way it works, at least the physics behind this whole conversation, is a smaller core, single mode, the yellow cable, the 9-micron core, keeps the light in phase over longer distances. A smaller pipe means those signals won't get out of phase. They'll stay in a tight pattern over long distances. Now, multimode, the aqua-colored cable, that's a bigger core, 5 times larger, 50 microns. Great cable because it's a little bit easier to handle because there's, you know, bigger glass inside of it. The electronics are a little bit less expensive because they can deal with multiple modes of transmission, multimode. But those signals start to get sloppy at about 1,000 feet. So multimode is designed for 1,000 feet or 300 meters in less transmission. Single mode can be any length. Single mode is also less expensive, and this is why you see it in a lot of pre-wire applications. People will often ask me, what's the best cable? Give me one cable. What should I pull? Should it be single mode? Should it be multimode? Well, most fiber manufacturers over the years, especially for AV, they have focused on multimode because it's easier to manufacture, right? Bigger piece of glass, doesn't have to be so pure, and the electronics are easier to build. But what we're finding is the cable manufacturing world has gotten really good. In single mode, not as expensive. In fact, it's less expensive than multimode, and those electronics aren't as expensive. They've come down in price. So when you start to look at the cost of systems and you start to look at what's the most commonly deployed cable, it is starting to fall towards single mode infrastructures. But it really has to do with what device are you trying to plug in. If you have an extender and it says it has to be multimode, you got to go with multimode. If you have a system or an application that's really long distances, it has to be single mode. And the good news is most electronics will do both now. They will accommodate both types of fiber. It comes down to what's your length, what's your application. Now, you also have to be aware of cable grade, okay? Single mode's easy because there's two, OS1 and OS2, and it speaks to the construction of the cable. And they also, here's the really nice thing about single mode, the core sizes are the same. Both use a 9-micron core. That means you can splice them together. So if you have an old system with OS1 and you've got new cable that's OS2, you can splice them together. You can take a coupler and put them together and it's fine. Multimode's not so easy. So multimode, we have 5 different grades, OM1 through OM5. OM1 is a discontinued size of glass, 62.5 microns. It's a big piece of glass. And frankly, it's a non-standard now. Most companies don't manufacture this because most electronics will not be compatible with 62.5 microns. You do not want to install OM1 because you will be very limited. It will not be useful in the future. OM2 is the right size. It's a standard size of glass. It's 50 microns, okay? The problem with OM2 is it's not very pure. So you don't get really high bandwidths out of it. You have a lot of loss. But more importantly, it's not designed for lasers. And most electronics in the optical category, they use lasers now. At a minimum, you want to use an OM3 cable. In fact, OM3 is going to be the standard pre-wire cable. Now, you are starting to see some really high bandwidth variations, OM4 and OM5. These are mainly reserved for patch cords, okay, when you're like patching two network switches together that need to hit 100 gig or something like really, really high in terms of bandwidth. But when you're talking about pre-wire, you got to understand a couple of things. So much of the bandwidth conversation is dictated by the electronics and what those electronics can do, okay? It's not really the cable. If you have a laser optimized cable, like an OS2 or an OM3, you have a pipe. You have an empty pipe that shoots a laser through it. The bandwidth capacity in those cables is up to 100 petagigs. Now, keep in mind, that's the cable, okay? It's an empty pipe. It can really send those lasers really far distances and really fast. But the problem is the electronics that plug into those cables, they just haven't caught up to the cable potential, okay? They don't have the signaling rights. They just don't have the optical capacity to take advantage of all that bandwidth. So if you pull an OM3 cable, and don't get me wrong, you know, we'd love to sell you a bunch of really expensive OM5, but you don't need it. OM3 is going to be your go-to for pre-wire. That's what I recommend for most people. OS2, certainly going to be your standard for pre-wire if you're doing single mode, okay? Pick one of those two cables, you'll be in good shape. Shorter patch cords, OM4, that's becoming the standard for patching different devices together. You don't need to do a pre-wire with it. Let's talk about connectors, because you got to put connectors on the end of these cables, right? Now, granted, most fiber is being pulled dark. It's not being used today. It's being pulled because it's not that expensive anymore and it's for future proofing. But it's the connectors that obviously are going to let you connect the devices. And there are a lot of different fiber optic connectors, you know, 6 ones that we've seen in most applications over the years. But today, if you look at most devices today, it's only 2. LC connectors, this is the small one, okay? A lot of people call it the little connector. Technically, it's the Lucent style connector. It's, we call it the Lucent connector because it's got a patent on it. It's a Lucent patent. And this is the little guy. This is the one that goes on network switches, goes on most video electronics because it lets you use a very small footprint on a circuit board. Okay, and when we think about AV, like an HDMI extender that's got to go behind a display, you got to make those things small. The LC connector, and we get asked this a lot, you know, the LC connector doesn't support more bandwidth than the bigger one. The SC connector, they both use the same tools. They both go on the same fiber. The termination process to put them on the cable is very similar. So really, in terms of application, the connectors are the same. It's just a physical footprint. The SC connector, or the subscriber connector, this is the one we use in a lot of Demarc wiring because we have more space to work with. We're not hung up on the electronics, but also because it's less expensive. It saves money. And when you're doing, you know, 1,000 homes or 10,000 different businesses, and you can save $1 on a connector, the telecom industry is going to do that. So we see the SC connector in a lot of those telecom applications. But again, one's not better than the other. There is a difference, though. If you have a polymer coated, like a clear line cable, an SSF cable, versus a bend-in sensitive glass cable, like a Corning style cable, there is a difference in termination process. Connectors are the same. Tools are the same, but the process is different. So here's my recommendation. If we were live, we'd get our tools out, we'd terminate. Can't do that on a webinar very easily. So I would recommend watch some videos. We have a lot of good videos online that in 3 to 5 minutes will walk you through how to terminate. And it'll show you based on what kind of connector you have, what kind of cable you have, how to make sure you're doing it properly. Watch a video, it'll definitely help. All right. Talk about a couple of applications, and we're going to talk about designing the system. Demarcation wiring is one of the most prominent applications for fiber. Okay, this is where we're bringing a fiber feed into the building. It's the cable run before the modem. And I will tell you, this is actually where we see the most issues with installations. People pull the wrong type of fiber. They pull multimode fiber. And you can't do that. Remember, it comes down to core size and it comes down to signal length. You gotta make sure that the feed going into that modem is going to be single mode fiber. This is going to be the standard in telecom installations. You can't do multi-mode. Now, it is possible to tie two different core size cables together, and we use media converters to do that, but it costs money and it's not easy to do. It's better to just make sure you pull the right type of fiber, which is single mode, okay? Now, once you get past that modem, you can pull whatever you want. You can pull multi-mode, you can pull single mode, but the reality is you're still working with a lot of twisted pair. And don't think that today my goal is to say you're never pulling twisted pair cable again. You're still working with it, right? And the reality is, while a lot of fiber is pulled dark, it's not being used, it's there for future proofing, a lot of fiber is being used, especially when you get into high bandwidth requirements and long distance requirements, or maybe you're concerned about lightning, right? You got to use that cable. But your electronics, your security camera, your access point, your network switches that were bought 2 years ago, they don't have fiber ports. So what do? How do we take a twisted pair connection and a twisted pair cable and tie it into fiber? And that's where the media converter comes in. So what a media converter does is it takes an electrical signal and converts it to an optical signal. These are not expensive, okay? In fact, this is going to be significantly less expensive than any twisted pair like HDMI extender. I mean, we're talking like half the price. These are very cost-effective boxes, and they're very, very effective boxes. This will be the #1 electronics that you use in most fiber optic applications, because say you've got that security camera, that gate camera, right? And you got to find a way to get that camera back to the head end. And that camera is normally limited to what? 100 meters, 330 feet, right? So how do we do it over 500 feet, 1,000 feet? Well, a media converter does that for you. It takes that RJ45 connection and goes into this media converter, converts it to a fiber connection, and now we just went 12 miles, okay? 21 kilometers with 0 frame rate latency. That's what fiber does. It's a laser. Takes that signal and goes a long distance, and oh, by the way, now your cable run is waterproof and immune to lightning, so when that pole gets struck with lightning, you don't have to worry about a surge backfeeding to your rack. Fiber is immune to that. So media converters are definitely going to be very important to your installation. Video extenders, these play a role as well, right? We're doing a theater. We need to get, full 18 gig uncompressed video. We want to get ready for 8K or 12K or 16K or whatever's coming next. Well, you pull a fiber line, you have the bandwidth. And if you've never seen these boxes before, there's a couple of cool things. So first of all, a lot of these solutions, they're being built so they look like HDBaseT extenders. You have ports for audio and video and control, right? So they serve the same role as a twisted pair extender. You just have a fiber connection. But you also see a lot of these boxes that are really tiny. Fiber doesn't have the same heat output that HDBaseT does. An optical circuit generates less heat, so you can make these boxes really compact. And they also don't consume a lot of electricity, so you can actually power them off of things like USB. So a lot of different moving parts here, but definitely pay attention to this part of the industry. All right, last part of the session, then we'll get to some questions. So if you do have questions, make sure you type those in. We'll get to that here in a minute. But let's make sure everybody understands how to design a system and what to do if it doesn't function. And I will tell you that even companies that have done fiber for many, many years, they don't necessarily understand the concept of link budgets. I'll explain why in a minute, but let's make sure you understand this, okay? So a link budget's comprised of two things, and very important to a fiber system, as you'll see here. You have a loss budget, which is how much loss do you anticipate being on a cable run based on the path and the equipment used and how many breaks like patch panels and keystones and things like that are in line. Well, we can look at that cable path and we can estimate how much loss we think we'll have. The power budget is how much loss can our devices tolerate. They can, electronics can have loss in the communication stream, but there comes a point at which they don't work anymore. Well, if you put these two things together, how much loss do I think I have? How much loss can I tolerate? That's our link budget, okay? And the reason I say a lot of folks who do fiber, they don't understand this, is because they use their fiber for networking. And network signals are very, very tolerant to loss. They deal with it very well, and that's because in the network world, you have packet correction, right? Part of the IP protocol, packet correction. If you have intermittent signal, loss doesn't translate into the signals not getting there necessarily. It translates into signals running more slowly. And your customer might not notice that their signals, their system is running slower than it really should be. But they'll notice if they flip on their TV and they have no image with their projector, or every 8 seconds, their screen flickers in and out. Video does not have packet correction. Video is much more susceptible to loss. So our power budget, if we're doing video distribution, is 3 to 5 dB. And if we're doing networking, is anywhere from 11 to 22 dB. That's a lot of loss, okay? You don't have to be very good at fiber and you'll still get a network system to work, okay? But obviously, you gotta be able to terminate. So again, watch the videos, get pre-terminated cable. Fiber, I mean, connectors are snap-on now, so it's not a hard thing to do. Where does the loss come from? Well, it's not the cable. Modern cable is very well built, very pure glass. Regardless of whether you're doing polymer coated or all polymer or glass, very high quality cables now. It's the break points, the splice points, the keystones, the patch panels. That is where the loss gets introduced into the system. And if we put this into practice, so let's look at a very common application. We have a theater, right? We're taking video from a rack and we're going to a remote projector. And if you do conference rooms, well, imagine this is a conference room and we're just moving video from the head end of the projector, or maybe it's a house of worship, or maybe it's a classroom. You're moving video. And we can look at this application, we can say, okay, we've got some connectors, we got a keystone, we got a patch cord. We can calculate our loss budget at 1.3 dB. Great. We know since we're moving video, we have a power budget of 3 dB. Okay, worst case scenario, 3 dB. This should work. This system works fine, right? It's when we get our meters out and we actually test the loss on that cable run and we find out that what should be 1.3 dB is actually 5 dB, or maybe 10 dB, or maybe it's 60 dB. Maybe we have a ton of loss. What's going on? How do we fix this? Well, this is where we turn to our VFL, okay? Visual fault locator. This is a visual spectrum laser, red, okay? The VFL is very handy because it'll show you if you have continuity in your cable, if your cable's proper, if it's not broken. But just as importantly, the VFL will also show you with most connectors if they're terminated properly. You got to make sure your connectors are terminated properly because that is where most loss comes from. And with a lot of these connectors, they're reusable. You can take them off, you can put them back on, you can re-terminate. That's the first place you want to start. But if you've done that, you still have more loss than you should. The second area of problem is typically dirty connections. Think about it. We are relying on optical waves to go from point A to point B. If there's any, oil or dust or pollen or barbecue sauce from lunch, whatever it may be, if you have contaminants on those lenses, those lasers can't fire properly. You're going to have loss. And this is a very common problem with retrofits. So if there's cable that's already been installed, it's also very common when you're working with fiber outdoors or on construction sites. Everything that's fiber-based will come with dust caps. Keep those dust caps in place as long as possible, but undoubtedly you're going to get contaminants. And this is why buying a cleaner, a pen style or click style cleaner is so important. These are not expensive. These will clean anywhere from 800 to 1,000 optical connections. It'll save you hours of troubleshooting. This is something that anybody working with fiber should have. Final thing that I want to mention before we wrap up here. There are different types of fiber out there. There are polymer clad, like a clear line polymer clad type cable. It's glass in the middle, but it's polymer coated. And then you've also got Corning style cables, bend-in sensitive glass. Both are very pliable, both are very strong, both terminate very quickly. It's just really your preference on the type of the cable that you want to work with. But then you also have older cables. And if you have older cables, you really want to handle those with care, because that older glass, while it still works fine and you can still terminate it, and you can still, you know, retool it and do things like that. If you exceed the bend radius, or if you shock it by like slamming it in a rack door, or, you know, pinching it in an articulating mount, it can break, but it can also fracture. Okay, and the microfracture is a very, very hard thing to troubleshoot, because that means it still works, but over time that fracture will spread and that cable will gradually fall apart. So what you want to make sure is you treat those older cables with care. You'll be in good shape. All right, with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, and certainly, again, you know, there's a lot more information on this fiber optic category that we can certainly help walk people through. We're here to, you know, dispel a lot of questions that folks have. I'm looking at the question section, the Q&A. I actually don't see any questions. That's usually a pretty good thing. Hopefully you got the answers that you need. And certainly, if there's anything that you do want to talk through, dive into a different, you know, more information, different topic, we're here for you to help you get involved in this new product category. You see our information on the screen. Again, if you are looking for renewal credit, we're happy to get you that information as well.
Cameron, thanks so much. That was a great presentation, great training.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
I think that's it. No questions.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. I just have a question in terms of different supported matrices that run on fiber, and maybe a combination of using a CAT matrix together with a fiber strand. Would you recommend putting a fiber cable in between if you've got an ultra long run where you might have a restriction that you're not getting to a specific point, that you could add a fiber run in between to sort of create a longer section?
Absolutely. It's a very common application because you can get all fiber matrices. They get really, really expensive. And the reality is most systems are kind of these hybrid systems where you'll have a couple of longer runs, or maybe you're connecting two buildings. And that's where a lot of these extenders are really nice, because they'll plug right into the back of a traditional HDMI or twisted pair matrix. And now you have that integration for that long cable run. But more importantly, if you have fiber pulled, that cable, while today it's 4K, can now be used in the future for 8K when that matrix gets upgraded. So you have options there. The other thing that you see a lot is the media converter. The media converter will allow you to take the streaming content, which today may be 1 gig, but again, that fiber line can be upgraded to 10 gig or whatever you need it to be in the future. So yes, hybrid systems are very common.
Okay, great.
Okay, any other questions? I see a question on tools. Are tools available? And yes, all the different tools to work with the fiber optic system, you can either purchase those individually, or you can get, you know, all-in-one toolkits that will allow you to not only terminate, but also troubleshoot. So this is a very well-developed category of product now. Okay. Well, perfect. Everyone, again, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate the opportunity to bring this technology in this class to our partnership. And be well. Take care out there.
Excellent. Thanks, Cameron. Really appreciate the time, and we'll be in touch. Thank you. Stay safe.
All right. Thanks.
Cool. Cheers. Bye.